Sorry, I don't want the divorce anymore, my husband said outside the courthouse. And if you think that sounds romantic, you should know what had happened 10 minutes earlier. I looked at Daniel standing there in his gray suit, his hands trembling slightly as he held the folder that was supposed to end our 42-year marriage. For a moment, he looked exactly like the young man I had married decades ago. The same blue eyes, the same careful smile, the same expression that used to make me believe everything would be all right. But age teaches you things hope never can. It teaches you that timing matters. And Daniel's timing was suspiciously perfect. The morning had started like any other difficult morning. I woke before sunrise in my small apartment, made a cup of coffee, and sat by the window watching the city slowly come alive. I thought I would feel devastated on the day our divorce became final. Instead, I felt calm. Not happy, not excited, just calm. The kind of calm that comes after years of disappointment. The kind that settles in when there are no more arguments left to have. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting inside the courthouse waiting for my name to be called. Daniel arrived a few minutes later. He barely looked at me. That wasn't unusual. Over the past 2 years, avoiding eye contact had become one of his favorite habits. Everything seemed routine until his phone rang. I watched him step outside to answer it. At first, his expression was neutral. Then confusion appeared. Then panic. Then something I hadn't seen in years, fear. He spoke rapidly, pacing back and forth across the sidewalk. When the call ended, he stood completely still. The confidence he had carried into that building disappeared in seconds. I didn't know exactly what had been said, but I knew something had changed. 3 minutes later, he walked back inside. 5 minutes later, he asked to speak with me privately. And 10 minutes later, standing beneath the courthouse steps while people passed by without noticing us, he suddenly said the words I never expected to hear. Sorry, Margaret. I don't want the divorce anymore. I simply stared at him. No tears, no anger, no dramatic reaction, just silence. He kept talking. He said he had made mistakes. He said people deserved second chances. He said we could rebuild what we had lost. The strange thing was that a year earlier, I might have believed him. 6 months earlier, I might have cried. But that morning, all I could think about was the fear I had seen on his face after that phone call. Daniel wasn't a man who changed his mind. He was a man who calculated outcomes. And suddenly, I realized something important. He wasn't standing there because he had rediscovered his love for me. He was standing there because something else had fallen apart. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked beyond him toward the parking lot where the future I thought I wanted was quietly disappearing. Then I smiled and asked a question that made all the color drain from his face. Did Vanessa leave you this morning, Daniel? Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked away, toward the line of cars parked along the curb, as if the asphalt might offer him an escape. That was answer enough. For years, I had watched that man avoid difficult truths by refusing to look directly at them. The silence stretched between us. A few months earlier, I would have filled that silence for him. I would have asked questions. I would have searched for explanations that made him seem better than he was. Not anymore. The courthouse doors opened behind us as people came and went, carrying folders, coffee cups, and pieces of their own complicated lives. Nobody paid attention to the elderly couple standing on the steps. To everyone else, we were just another marriage ending. They had no idea ours had actually ended long before the paperwork. Daniel finally cleared his throat. It is not what you think, he said. I almost laughed. That sentence had followed every major mistake he had made during the last 2 years. It was not what I thought when he started staying out late. It was not what I thought when he began guarding his phone like a state secret. It was not what I thought when he suddenly became interested in looking 20 years younger. The problem was that eventually reality becomes impossible to disguise. Then tell me what happened, I said quietly. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. No words came out. I realized something remarkable in that moment. Daniel had spent so much time constructing stories that he no longer knew how to tell the truth. The strange part was that I was not angry. Anger requires energy. I had exhausted mine long ago. Instead, I felt something closer to curiosity. I wanted to understand how a man who had seemed so certain about leaving had become desperate to stay. As I stood there watching him struggle, memories surfaced one by one. Not dramatic memories. Small ones. The kind that matter most. Sitting alone at Thanksgiving while he claimed he had a business dinner. Eating birthday cake with our daughter while his chair stayed empty. Listening to him promise that things would improve once work became less stressful. There was always a reason, always an excuse, always a future version of our marriage that never arrived. The truth was that our marriage had not collapsed in a single day. It had faded inch by inch, conversation by conversation, disappointment by disappointment. Looking back, I could almost see the trail of cracks spreading across the years. Daniel rubbed his forehead and looked exhausted. Older than 71. Older than the confident man who had demanded a divorce 6 months earlier. "Margaret," he said softly, "I made a terrible mistake." I studied his face. For the first time in a very long while, he seemed afraid. Not afraid of losing me, afraid of losing something else. And that was when I remembered the expression he wore after answering that phone call. Fear, shock, desperation. Whatever had happened that morning had changed everything. The question was not whether Vanessa had left him. The question was why. And somehow, I had a feeling the answer would explain far more than Daniel ever intended me to know. The answer began revealing itself as I stood there on those courthouse steps. Not because Daniel suddenly became honest, but because I had spent the last 6 months learning how to pay attention. There was a time when I ignored details that made me uncomfortable. Marriage teaches many women to do that. We smooth over strange moments. We explain away inconsistencies. We tell ourselves that loyalty means believing the best about someone. Looking back, I realized that I had been protecting Daniel from consequences long before he ever left me. Vanessa Brooks entered our lives almost 2 years earlier. At first, she was just a name. Someone from a charitable committee. Someone who supposedly shared Daniel's interest in community projects. He mentioned her casually. Then he mentioned her often. Eventually, he stopped mentioning her at all. That was when I knew she mattered. Important things are rarely hidden by accident. They are hidden on purpose. I remember the first time I met her. It was at a fundraising dinner downtown. She was polished, confident, and nearly 25 years younger than me. She shook my hand warmly and complimented my necklace. Daniel watched her more than he listened to me that evening. It was subtle. Most people would not have noticed. I did. I simply chose not to react. Months passed. Daniel became increasingly distracted. New clothes appeared in his closet. Expensive cologne replaced the scent he had worn for years. He joined a fitness club, started checking his reflection in windows, suddenly cared about things that had never mattered to him before. Meanwhile, our conversations grew shorter. Our dinners grew quieter. Our home felt larger and emptier at the same time. One evening, I found him sitting alone on the patio after midnight. He looked almost guilty when he noticed me. Not because of anything I had discovered, because he knew what he was becoming. Some people think betrayal begins with a single decision. I do not believe that anymore. I think it begins with hundreds of tiny choices, tiny silences, tiny lies, tiny acts of selfishness that grow larger over time. Eventually, they become a completely different person standing in front of you. When Daniel asked for a divorce 6 months ago, he sounded rehearsed, calm, certain. He spoke about finding happiness, about wanting a different future, about needing to be honest with himself. What he never mentioned was Vanessa. He did not have to. By then, her presence filled every unspoken space in the room. I remember signing the preliminary documents and feeling strangely relieved. Heartbroken, yes, but relieved, because uncertainty had finally ended. The waiting was over. The guessing was over. The pretending was over. Now, standing outside the courthouse, I studied the same man who had walked away so confidently months earlier. The confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. Whatever future he had imagined for himself had cracked apart before reaching the finish line. And as I watched his nervous eyes search for answers, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. Vanessa had not simply left. Something much bigger had happened. Something Daniel was desperately trying to keep me from discovering. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The traffic moved through downtown. A siren echoed somewhere in the distance. People climbed the courthouse steps carrying their own worries. Life continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet I could feel that something important was sitting just beneath the surface of Daniel's silence. "You already knew about Vanessa, did you not?" he finally asked. I nodded. There was no point pretending otherwise. His shoulders sagged slightly, not because he was surprised, because he realized he had lost control of the conversation. For years, Daniel had been the one deciding what information I received and when I received it. That dynamic no longer existed. "Then you understand why things became complicated," he said. I almost smiled. Complicated. It was such a harmless word for something that had caused so much damage. I remembered the afternoon he moved out. The moving truck had taken less than 3 hours to empty half the house. 42 years reduced to labeled cardboard boxes. I stood in the kitchen afterwards staring at the empty space where his favorite coffee mugs used to sit. The silence felt enormous. But strangely, it also felt honest. There were no more excuses filling the rooms. No more pretending that we were still building a future together. During the months that followed, I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I joined a book club at the local library. I started taking morning walks through the park. I learned how peaceful dinner could be when every conversation did not feel like a negotiation. The loneliness was real, but so was the freedom. Somewhere along the way, I stopped waiting for Daniel to come back. That was why his sudden change of heart felt so strange. He was arriving at a place I had already left. "What happened this morning?" I asked quietly. His eyes immediately dropped toward the folder in his hands. Another answer without words. Fear crossed his face again. The same fear I had noticed after the phone call. "It is complicated," he repeated. "No," I said. "It is probably very simple." He looked at me carefully. I could almost see him debating how much to reveal. Then his phone buzzed again. The sound seemed to make him flinch. He glanced at the screen and quickly turned it face down. That tiny movement told me more than any explanation could have. Whatever was happening was still unfolding. Whatever crisis had driven him back toward me had not ended. I folded my arms and waited. Eventually, people tell you things when silence becomes uncomfortable enough. Daniel inhaled slowly and looked toward the street. "Vanessa left," he admitted. "I know that part," I replied. "Why?" Another pause. Longer this time. His expression hardened with embarrassment. Then, for the first time all morning, I saw a genuine defeat in his eyes. "Because," he said quietly, "she discovered something she was never supposed to find out." Daniel stared at the sidewalk for several seconds after speaking those words. I could tell he regretted saying them the moment they left his mouth. Some truths are easier to carry in silence than out in the open. What was she not supposed to find out? I asked. His jaw tightened. For a man who had spent months convincing everyone he was confident in his choices, he suddenly looked very small. Finally, he exhaled slowly. "She thought I was worth a lot more money than I actually am." I blinked once. That was not the answer I expected, although it explained more than he realized. A strange calm settled over me. The pieces that had never quite fit together suddenly began sliding into place. Over the past year, Daniel had acted like a man preparing for a glamorous second chapter. Expensive dinners, weekend trips, new clothes, a leased luxury vehicle he could barely justify. At the time, I assumed he was trying to impress Vanessa. Now I understood something else. He had been trying to impress himself. "She believed you were wealthy," I said. "She believed the stories," he replied quietly. Stories. That word caught my attention. Daniel had always been talented at presenting the version of reality he preferred. He was not exactly a liar. He simply edited facts until they became more flattering. "What stories?" I asked. He looked embarrassed. "That I owned more of the investments than I actually did. That I had access to accounts that were never really mine. That my retirement income was much larger than it is." I folded my arms and listened. Months ago, hearing this would have devastated me. Standing there now, it felt almost surreal. The man who had walked away from a stable marriage had built his future on assumptions and appearances. And she found out the truth? I asked. He nodded. "This morning." The answer came so quickly that I knew it was genuine. "How?" His expression darkened. "She met with a financial advisor because we were discussing future plans. The advisor asked questions. Numbers came up. She realized things were not what she expected. Future plans." The phrase lingered in my mind. Daniel had been ready to build an entirely new life. He had pictured a future that depended on someone seeing him as successful, desirable, and secure. Then a simple conversation had shattered the illusion. I looked toward the courthouse entrance. People continued walking in and out without noticing us. The world remained wonderfully indifferent to personal disasters. "So she left because of money," I said. "She left because she realized the life she imagined did not exist." Daniel swallowed hard. There it was. The truth. Not dramatic. Not complicated. Just disappointing. The saddest part was not that Vanessa walked away. The saddest part was that Daniel seemed genuinely shocked she had done it. As though he had mistaken attention for loyalty. As though he had forgotten that relationships built on appearances rarely survive reality. Then I noticed something else. The fear in his eyes was still there, which meant Vanessa leaving was only part of the story. And somehow, I knew the next piece would be even worse. The realization should have satisfied me. It should have explained everything. A younger woman discovered that the future she expected was not real and decided to leave. Simple, predictable, almost ordinary. Yet the expression on Daniel's face told a different story. He still looked like a man standing on unstable ground. His phone buzzed again. This time he silenced it immediately. "You keep looking at that phone like it contains bad news," I said. He forced a weak smile. "It does." I waited. The silence between us stretched until he finally rubbed his forehead and sighed. When Vanessa left this morning, she did not just walk away. His voice dropped. She told other people why. Suddenly everything made sense. Reputation. That was the missing piece. Daniel had spent years carefully building an image. Reliable businessman. Community volunteer. Successful retiree. The kind of man people admired. He had protected that image almost as fiercely as he protected his pride. If Vanessa had started talking, the damage would travel quickly. Small towns and professional circles have long memories. "Who knows?" I asked. "Too many people," he admitted. "Friends. Members of the committee. A few investors. People I worked with." He looked exhausted. She was angry. I nodded slowly. Angry people often become honest in ways they normally would not. I found myself remembering a conversation I had with my daughter shortly after Daniel moved out. She had looked at me across a restaurant table and said something I did not fully understand at the time. "Mom, sometimes people leave because they think the grass is greener somewhere else. Then they discover it was artificial turf." I smiled at the memory. Back then, I was still grieving the marriage. Now I understood exactly what she meant. Daniel had spent months chasing an illusion. He had traded certainty for excitement, loyalty for attention, stability for fantasy. And now the fantasy was collapsing in public. "Is that why you want to stop the divorce?" I asked quietly. He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. Not because he answered incorrectly, because he could not answer immediately. When love is genuine, people do not need time to search for explanations. They simply know. Daniel stared at the courthouse doors. "I realized what I was about to lose," he finally said. Maybe part of him believed that. Maybe part of him truly regretted the choices he had made. Human beings are complicated. Regret and self-interest often arrive together. The problem was that I could no longer tell the difference in him. A year ago, I would have given him the benefit of the doubt. 6 months ago, I might have cried. Today, I simply observed. As I watched him struggle to rebuild a bridge he had burned himself, another thought entered my mind. If Vanessa had only discovered the truth this morning, then someone else must have revealed it. Someone had connected the dots. Someone had access to information Daniel never expected them to see. And judging by the fear that still lingered behind his eyes, I suspected that person had uncovered far more than a disappointing bank statement. The more I thought about it, the less I believed this situation had unfolded by accident. Someone had exposed the truth. Someone had pulled back the curtain on the version of himself that Daniel had been presenting for months. I looked at him carefully. His posture had changed. His confidence was gone. Even his voice sounded different. For years, Daniel had always spoken as though he was one step ahead of everyone else. Now he seemed like a man trying desperately to catch up with events already moving beyond his control. "Who told her?" I asked. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Why does that matter?" "Because it matters to you," I replied. He looked away again. Another answer hidden inside a silence. Eventually he sighed. One of the advisors reviewing some documents started asking questions. Vanessa was there. She heard everything. I nodded slowly. Financial advisors deal in facts. Facts have a way of surviving even when stories do not. "And she left immediately?" I asked. "Not immediately," he admitted. "First, she wanted explanations." That almost made me smile. For the first time all morning, I could picture the scene clearly. Vanessa sitting across a conference table. Daniel trying to explain numbers that did not match the future he had described. Questions becoming harder to answer. Confidence turning into discomfort. Discomfort turning into panic. Reality arriving all at once. "Then what happened?" I asked. Daniel swallowed hard. She said she felt misled. The words hung between us. Misled. An interesting choice. Not betrayed. Not hurt. Not heartbroken. Misled. The language of expectations that failed to materialize. The language of someone disappointed by an investment. I found myself feeling strangely detached from the entire situation. Months ago, I had imagined Vanessa as a rival, someone who had stolen something valuable from me. Standing there now, I realized she had been chasing an illusion every bit as much as Daniel had. Neither of them had truly seen the other. They had both fallen in love with stories. And now, I asked, now people are talking. His voice was barely above a whisper. There it was again. The real fear. Not loneliness. Not regret. Exposure. I remembered all the dinners where Daniel enjoyed being admired. All the community events where he shook hands and accepted compliments. Reputation had always mattered to him, sometimes more than truth. The phone buzzed again. This time he looked at the screen and closed his eyes. For a second, I thought he might ignore it. Instead, he opened the message. Whatever he read caused every trace of color to disappear from his face. What is it? I asked. Daniel lowered the phone slowly. His expression looked worse than before. Much worse. That was Richard, he said quietly. I recognized the name immediately. Richard had been one of his oldest professional contacts for nearly 20 years. What happened? I asked. Daniel stared at the message. Then he looked directly at me. Apparently, he said, Vanessa was not the only person who started asking questions today. Daniel lowered the phone and stared at the screen as if reading the message again might somehow change it. I had known him long enough to recognize genuine panic when I saw it. This was not the discomfort of a difficult conversation. This was something deeper, something unraveling. What questions? I asked. He hesitated before slipping the phone into his pocket. Richard wants to review several reports, he said. He thinks some numbers do not add up. I nodded slowly. For years, Daniel had relied on confidence to carry him through situations that required transparency. Confidence can be persuasive. It can even be impressive. But confidence is not evidence. Eventually, facts demand their turn. We stood there quietly while a cold breeze moved through the street. I remembered how different this day was supposed to be. 6 months ago, Daniel had spoken about freedom, about new beginnings, about opportunities waiting ahead. He had seemed certain that life was opening doors for him. Now every door appeared to be swinging shut at the same time. Are the reports wrong? I asked. No, he admitted. The reports are accurate. That answer surprised me. Not because it revealed a scandal, because it revealed something far simpler. The image he had created was collapsing under the weight of ordinary truth. The investments were smaller than people believed. The retirement accounts were less impressive than he implied. The opportunities were not as secure as they appeared. There was no dramatic secret fortune, no hidden empire. Just a retired man approaching his 70s who had spent too much energy pretending he was someone else. Richard never asked these questions before, Daniel said quietly. People rarely do when everything looks successful. I replied. They start asking when the story changes. He looked at me carefully. I could tell he knew I was right. Success attracts admiration. Failure attracts curiosity. The phone buzzed once more. This time he did not even look at it. I found that interesting. Whatever message had arrived, he already knew it would not help. Margaret, he said suddenly, I made terrible decisions. It was probably the most honest sentence I had heard from him in years. Yet even then, I noticed something missing. He talked about decisions. He talked about mistakes. He talked about consequences. But he still had not truly talked about me. About the marriage. About the life we built together. Somehow the conversation always returned to his problems. His embarrassment. His losses. His fears. That realization settled over me with surprising clarity. For months, I had wondered whether I was grieving the man I married or the memory of him. Standing there outside the courthouse, I finally understood the answer. The man I married would have worried about hurting his family. The man standing in front of me was worried about losing his reputation. Then another thought occurred to me. If Richard and others had started examining the truth today, there was a strong chance they would discover things Daniel had never expected anyone to question. And judging by the way his hands trembled when his phone buzzed again, I suspected he was beginning to realize that too. For the first time that morning, I felt completely certain about what I needed to do. Not because Daniel had finally revealed the truth. Not because Vanessa had left. Not because other people were beginning to question the stories he had spent months telling. My certainty came from something much simpler. I no longer wanted to spend my life waiting for someone else to become the person they should have been all along. Daniel looked tired. Older than he had a year ago. The confidence that once filled every room had vanished. In its place stood a man surrounded by consequences he could not control. "Margaret," he said quietly, "please do not do this." I almost smiled. The strange thing was that I was not doing anything to him. The decisions that brought us here belonged entirely to him. The choices were his. The risks were his. The losses were his. I was simply refusing to rescue him from them. For decades, I had been the person who softened every landing. When money was tight, I adjusted. When plans failed, I adapted. When life became difficult, I stayed. Loyalty had become second nature to me. But loyalty without respect eventually becomes self-abandonment. And I had finally learned the difference. The courthouse doors opened again. An employee stepped outside and called several names. Ours would be next. Daniel glanced toward the entrance and then back at me. Panic flickered across his face. "We can fix this," he said. "We can start over." I listened carefully, not because I was considering his offer, because I wanted to hear whether he understood what had actually been broken. He talked about the future. He talked about mistakes. He talked about second chances. Yet he never once spoke about trust. He never spoke about honesty. He never spoke about the years I spent feeling invisible while he chased a life he imagined would make him happier. In that moment, I realized something important. Daniel did not miss our marriage. He missed the security it provided. He missed having someone who believed in him regardless of circumstances. He missed certainty. But certainty is not the same thing as love. I took a slow breath and looked at the man I had spent 42 years beside. Surprisingly, I felt no bitterness, no anger, no desire for revenge, just peace. The kind of peace that arrives when a difficult decision finally becomes clear. "I hope things work out for you," I said. His eyes widened slightly. He knew what those words meant. They were kind, respectful, final. We walked back toward the courthouse entrance together, but it felt different now. Not like a husband and wife taking their last steps side by side. More like two strangers whose paths had already separated. A few minutes later, the paperwork was complete. The marriage was officially over. When I stepped back outside into the afternoon sunlight, I felt lighter than I had in years. Behind me, Daniel remained near the courthouse steps holding his phone, still waiting for answers. I kept walking, because sometimes the greatest victory is not proving someone wrong. Sometimes it is finally choosing yourself after years of choosing everyone else.